At 67 years old, Eleanor Vance stood in the gravel parking lot of the firm she had spent 40 years building. But what her husband Julian didn't know, what he was too smug to realize, was that a forged signature leaves a trail that eventually leads back to the truth. The document in her hand felt like a death sentence, but it was actually the first page of a story about how the universe balances the scales. If you've ever given your best years to someone who traded you in for a newer model, if you've been told your contributions no longer matter because of the grey in your hair, if you've ever felt the cold weight of a betrayal from the person who swore to protect you, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because the moment Eleanor finds what was hidden inside a rotting timber beam will prove that no lie can stay buried forever. Eleanor was a lead architect who knew every structural load and weight-bearing wall of the city's skyline. She had spent 4 decades drafting the blueprints, while Julian took the handshakes and the awards in the front office. She worked through the pneumonia of 1,994 to meet the deadline for the hospital wing, because he told her the family future depended on it. She moved her desk into a windowless basement during the lean years so they could afford to keep the senior engineers on payroll. When the firm finally made its first million, she sat in the back row of the gala and watched him accept the trophy alone. She never asked for her name to be carved into the stone over the entrance. She believed the marriage was the only contract that mattered. Julian sat in the mahogany-paneled boardroom 2 hours ago. He didn't look at Eleanor when he pushed the final settlement papers across the polished wood. He was busy adjusting the knot of his silk tie in the reflection of his computer monitor. He told her she was being emotional. He said the changes were just a way to simplify the estate for her retirement. He called it a clean break. He said she would be much more comfortable in the tidal mill cottage out on the estuary. He didn't mention that he had already signed her name to the divestment papers 3 months prior. The clerk at the registrar's office had been a woman about Eleanor's age, with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She had looked at the computer screen and then back at the original business register from 30 years ago. She pointed to a signature on a document dated last November. The ink was dark and the loops were wide. It looked like Eleanor's handwriting to anyone who didn't know her, but Eleanor always crossed her letters with a slight downward slant. The signature on the screen was perfectly horizontal. The registrar confirmed the removal of her name had been processed using that document. Eleanor felt the air leave the room. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the sharp point of her silver drafting compass. Her father had given it to her for her 20th birthday. She told him then she wanted to build things that would last a century. It was heavy and cold. She squeezed the metal until the point pressed into her thumb. The pain helped her focus. The firm was gone. The bank accounts were being drained into offshore funds she could not access. Julian had even kept the house in the city. He claimed his new lifestyle required the proximity to the office. Eleanor walked toward her car. It was an old station wagon Julian had called an eyesore. Barnaby was waiting in the back seat. His grey muzzle rested on the window frame. He wagged his tail once. The tail hit the side of a cardboard box. That box contained everything Eleanor owned after 40 years of marriage. She looked back at the glass tower of Vance and Associates. The sun was hitting the windows and turning them into sheets of gold. Julian was up there in the penthouse suite. He thought he had won. He thought she was heading to the estuary to fade away in the salt air. He was wrong about both. Eleanor Vance was 67 years old when she realized that a foundation built on trust is only as strong as the person standing next to you. She had spent 40 years believing that her marriage was a joint venture. She thought every late night spent over a drafting table was a brick in a house they were building together. But legacies are often written in disappearing ink. In the spring of 1982, Eleanor had stayed awake for 72 consecutive hours. The blueprints for the city's new central library had a 3-degree error in the load-bearing columns. Julian had gone to sleep at 10 o'clock that Tuesday night. He told her he needed to be sharp for the client meeting the next morning. Eleanor sat at the drafting table with her silver compass. She recalculated the stress points until the sun came up. She corrected the drawings by hand. She never told the client who had actually found the mistake that would have collapsed the roof. Julian accepted the Structural Integrity Award on a stage 3 months later. He didn't mention her name once in his speech. Eleanor watched from the back of the room and clapped until her palms were red. When the recession hit in 1999, the firm faced a 6-figure deficit. The payroll for 40 engineers was 3 days away from bouncing. Eleanor didn't panic. She took her mother's Victorian emerald ring and a small plot of inherited woodland to a dealer in the city. She sold them both for cash. She walked back to the office and deposited the money into the business account. She told Julian the bank had approved a last-minute line of credit. He used that money to pay the staff. He told the engineers that his savvy financial maneuvering had saved their jobs. Eleanor went back to her desk and finished the drawings for a parking garage. She never saw the emerald ring again. The most recent sacrifice happened in 2012 during the Riverside Development Project. Julian had forgotten to file the environmental impact study with the city council. The project was 3 weeks behind schedule. The city threatened a $50,000 daily fine that would have bankrupted them. Eleanor walked into the board meeting and took the blame. She told the council members it was her personal oversight. She accepted a formal reprimand from the architectural board. Julian kept his seat on the prestigious design council. He told her later that evening that he appreciated her loyalty. He said it was what partners did for each other. Eleanor had a routine that never changed in 4 decades. She arrived at the office at 7 in the morning. She made a pot of coffee and drank it from a chipped ceramic mug. She kept that mug at her desk because Julian said it looked unprofessional in the common kitchen. She spent the first hour of every day sharpening her pencils and cleaning the lead from her silver compass. She had used that same compass to design the foundations of 3 hospitals and 2 university campuses. It was a tool of precision. It didn't lie. It didn't exaggerate. It simply measured the truth of a curve or the distance of a line. She trusted Julian because of a memory from their first year of business. They had been working in a drafty studio with 1 space heater. Julian had brought her a blue ceramic mug of coffee at 11 o'clock every night for a month. He told her then that they were the perfect team. He said she was the brains and he was the voice. She believed him. She thought the voice would always speak her name. She thought the brains would always be protected by the heart. 1 week before the betrayal, Eleanor had been looking for a misplaced file in Julian's desk. She found a leather-bound folder she didn't recognize. Inside was a list of assets and a series of signature practice sheets. Her name was written dozens of times in Julian's hand. She watched him walk into the room. He smiled and took the folder from her. He said it was just some old paperwork for a new tax strategy. He kissed her forehead. He told her to go home and rest. He said he would handle the boring details. She had stood in the doorway and watched him lock the folder in his safe. She felt a cold shiver move down her spine. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that 40 years of marriage earned a person the benefit of the doubt. She went home and made dinner. She set 2 places at the table. She waited until midnight. Julian didn't come home. He texted her at 1 in the morning to say the meeting was running late. Eleanor sat in the dark living room with Barnaby. The dog rested his heavy head on her knee. She reached into her pocket and touched the cold metal of her drafting compass. She wondered when the voice had stopped speaking for the team. She wondered when the voice had started planning to speak only for itself. The silence in the house felt heavy. It felt like a building that had been hollowed out from the inside. The walls were still standing, but the support beams were gone. Eleanor Vance was 67 years old when she walked into the attorney's office on a Tuesday that smelled of wet pavement and expensive leather. She wore her forest green wool coat with the frayed silk lining. She sat in a chair made of chrome and black cowhide. Julian sat across from her. He was wearing a navy suit she had picked out for his 50th birthday. He didn't look at her. He spent the first 10 minutes of the meeting scrolling through his phone. He adjusted his gold cufflinks. He looked at his watch 3 times while the attorney, a man named Miller, opened a thick blue file. "The documents are ready for your acknowledgement, Eleanor," Miller said. His voice was as dry as the paper he was sliding across the mahogany table. Julian finally looked up from his screen. He leaned forward and placed his hands on the table. His wedding ring was gone. There was a pale circle of skin where the gold had lived for 40 years. "We're just being realistic, Eleanor," he said. He kept his voice low and soothing. It was the same voice he used to calm nervous investors. "At your age, you can't manage the stress of the firm. The board agrees. It's what's best for everyone." Eleanor looked at the signature on the top page. It was the horizontal line she had seen at the registrar. "I never signed this, Julian," she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was a flat, architectural statement of fact. Julian sighed. He looked at Miller and gave a small, pitying shake of his head. "We're worried about you, Mum," he said, using the title he only used when he wanted something. "You've been forgetting things. You've been under so much pressure. We're not being cruel. We're being practical. You should have planned better for your later years." Miller began to read the distribution of assets. The rhythm of the words sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. The main office on 5th Street to Julian. The architectural licenses and the patents to Julian. The 40% stake in the partnership to Julian. The colonial house with the wraparound porch to Julian. The retirement accounts and the liquid assets to Julian. While he checked a notification on his phone and smiled at the screen, Eleanor received what they called the rest. The rest was a salt-crusted deed to a decommissioned tidal mill at the edge of the Blackwater Estuary, Julian said. He stood up and buttoned his jacket. He didn't look at the deed. He looked at the window. You're not getting nothing. You're getting a property. It's a clean break, Eleanor. The mill is yours. It's what you always said you wanted, peace and quiet. He walked around the table. He didn't touch her shoulder. He stopped by the door and checked his watch again. I left Barnaby in your car. He's a bit much for the new penthouse. Too much hair on the white rugs. You'll be so much more comfortable there with him. The cruelty was in the casual way he said it. He was discarding a dog and a wife in the same breath. He was handing her a ruin and calling it a gift. Julian reached for the door handle. He stopped and looked back at her. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Eleanor. Just take the mill and the dog. It's a fair trade for a fresh start. Eleanor didn't move. She felt the silver drafting compass in her pocket, the sharp point pressed against her thigh. She thought about the library roof she had saved. She thought about the emerald ring she had sold to pay the men Julian was now leading. She looked at the man she had built a life with. He looked like a building with a beautiful facade and a hollow core. You should have looked at the blueprints, Julian, she said. Julian laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that didn't reach his eyes. There are no more blueprints for you, Eleanor. Just the salt air. He walked out of the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The sound echoed in the expensive silence of the office. Eleanor remained in the chair. She looked at the rusty iron key sitting on the mahogany table. It was pitted with orange corrosion. It looked like a piece of junk from a shipwreck. She picked up the key. Eleanor Vance sat in the driver's seat of her rusted station wagon for 20 minutes before she turned the key. The rain drummed against the metal roof with a hollow, rhythmic sound that reminded her of a coffin being closed. She didn't cry. Architects don't cry when a structure fails. They look at the debris and try to understand the physics of the collapse. She looked at her hands. They were steady, but they felt heavy, as if the gravity in the parking lot had suddenly doubled. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. The screen was a black mirror that reflected the deep lines around her eyes and the silver of her hair. She tapped the glass. The lock screen showed a photo of Barnaby as a puppy, sleeping in a sunbeam on the floor of the office. There were no new messages. There were no missed calls from her friends or the colleagues she had mentored for 20 years. The silence was an observable fact. Julian had spent the last 6 months telling everyone she was having a breakdown. He had prepared the ground for her disappearance long before he handed her the papers. The last message in her inbox was from a dry cleaner. It was a notification that a coat she could no longer afford to collect was ready for pickup. She deleted it. She opened her banking app with a trembling thumb. The screen loaded slowly. The numbers finally appeared in a small, cold font. She had $12.45 in her checking account. She reached into her coat pocket and found 2 crumpled $5 bills and 3 quarters. She had $23.20 to her name. It was not enough for a hotel. It was not enough for a deposit on a studio apartment. It was barely enough for 2 tanks of gas and a bag of dog food. Barnaby let out a soft, low whine from the back seat. Eleanor looked in the rearview mirror. The golden retriever's eyes were cloudy with age, but they were fixed on her with absolute focus. He didn't care about the penthouse. He didn't care about the white rugs or the mahogany boardrooms. He shifted his weight, and the car swayed. His loyalty was the only thing Julian hadn't been able to forge or steal. "It's just us, Barnaby," Eleanor whispered. Her voice sounded strange in the small space of the car. It sounded like someone else's voice. She reached into the center console and pulled out the silver drafting compass. It was the second time she had reached for it in an hour. She held the metal legs of the tool and adjusted the hinge. It moved with a smooth, oiled precision that gave her a momentary sense of order. The compass didn't care about betrayal. It only cared about geometry. She traced the circle of the steering wheel with the metal point. She needed a fixed point. She needed a center. She looked at the crumpled deed on the passenger seat. The address was written in Miller's cramped, legalistic hand. Blackwater Estuary, Tidal Mill number 4. She remembered Julian's grandfather talking about the mill when she was a young bride. He had called it a stone anchor that would keep the family grounded. Julian had called it a pile of wet rocks. Eleanor shifted the car into gear. The transmission groaned. She had no home. She had no job. She had no husband. She looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was hovering just above the halfway mark. She calculated the distance in her head. The estuary was 3 hours east. If she drove at a steady speed, she could make it before the sun went down. She pulled out of the parking lot. She didn't look at the glass tower in the rearview mirror. She didn't look at the city skyline she had helped to shape. She kept her eyes on the road and her hand on the silver compass in her pocket. The rain continued to fall, turning the world into a grey blur of water and light. She felt a sharp pain in her lower back and a dull ache in her knees. She was 67 years old, and she was driving toward a ruin because she had nowhere else to go. She drove past the suburbs and the shopping malls. She watched the brick buildings turn into wooden houses and then into open fields. The world was getting emptier. The houses were getting smaller. The trees were getting thinner and more bent by the wind. She stopped at a gas station and spent $10 on a bag of kibble and a gallon of water. She had $13.20 left. As she neared the coast, the air began to smell of salt and decaying vegetation. The fog rolled in from the Atlantic, thick and white. It swallowed the hood of the car. Eleanor slowed down to 20 miles per hour. She peered through the windshield, looking for the turnoff. The road was narrow and flanked by tall yellow grass that bowed under the weight of the mist. She saw the sign. It was a piece of weathered wood hanging by a single rusted chain. Blackwater Road. She turned the wheel. The tires crunched on wet gravel. Barnaby stood up in the back and pressed his nose against the window. He let out a sharp, single bark. Eleanor stopped the car. The headlights cut through the fog and illuminated a massive, dark shape at the edge of the water. It looked like a hunched giant. The stone walls were covered in dark green ivy. The roof was a jagged line against the grey sky. The tide was coming in, and the water was swirling around the base of the structure. It was colder here. The wind shook the car. She turned off the engine. At 67 years old, Eleanor Vance stood before the ghost of her husband's family legacy. The fog was a wall of wet wool that clung to her coat and turned her silver hair into a damp cap. She looked at the mill and then back at the dashboard of her car. She needed to be sure she was in the right place. She drove back a mile toward the small cluster of buildings she had passed in the mist. The town of Blackwater looked like it had been forgotten by the modern world. A general store sat on the main corner with a faded blue awning that flapped rhythmically in the wind. Across the street, a small diner displayed checkered curtains and a neon sign that flickered with a dying hum. There was a white church with a modest steeple and a gas station with 2 rusted pumps standing like sentinels in the yard. Eleanor parked the station wagon and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. The boards groaned under her weight. An old man in a canvas jacket was sweeping the steps of the general store. He stopped when he saw her. He leaned on his broom and pushed a battered cap back from his forehead. He looked at the car and then at Eleanor's forest green coat. "You're a bit late, Eleanor Vance," he said. Eleanor froze. She had never been to this town in her life. She reached into her pocket and gripped the silver drafting compass. "Do I know you?" "I'm Elias Thorne," the man said. He had a face like a topographical map and eyes the color of the estuary. "I was the clerk here for 40 years. Arthur Vance told us you'd come eventually after he passed. He said to watch for a woman with a silver tool and a steady gaze. That's you, isn't it?" Eleanor couldn't find her voice. "Arthur died 10 years ago. He knew his grandson," Elias said. He spat into the gravel. He knew what kind of man Julian was becoming. "He said the mill would wait until the city was done with you. We've been waiting too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy iron weight. He handed it to her. It was a plumb bob, the kind used by masons to find a true vertical line. The mill doesn't care about signatures on a piece of paper. It only cares about who knows how to hold the walls up. Eleanor took the weight. It was cold and solid. "I only have $13.20, she said. Elias started sweeping again. "Money doesn't spend well in a flood, Eleanor. Go on back to the mill. The tide is turning." She drove back to the water's edge. The mill was worse than the legal papers had described. The ivy had forced its way into the mortar of the stone walls. The massive wooden waterwheel was frozen in a tangle of river weeds and silt. Half the shingles on the roof were gone, exposing the skeletal rafters to the salt spray. It was a ruin. It was a structural failure in the making. She walked toward the heavy oak door. She pulled the rusty iron key from her pocket. Her hands were shaking so hard she missed the lock twice. She stopped and took a deep breath. She thought about the hospitals she had designed and the libraries she had built. She thought about the precision of a blueprint. She looked up at the lintel above the door. A single granite block was carved with a perfect geometric circle. Inside the circle was an image of a drafting compass, identical to the one in her pocket. The sight of it stopped her heart. Julian had called this place a pile of wet rocks because he didn't understand what he was looking at. He only saw the decay. He didn't see the intention. Eleanor pushed the key into the lock. The metal groaned and resisted. She put her shoulder against the wood and turned the key with everything she had left. There was a loud, metallic crack that echoed across the water. The bolt slid back. The door swung inward on heavy iron hinges. The air inside smelled of ancient dust, salt, and the particular sweetness of cedar. The floor was covered in a layer of dried mud and dead leaves. Barnaby squeezed past her and ran into the darkness. He sat down and waited. Eleanor stepped over the threshold. Eleanor Vance spent her first night in the mill, huddled on a pile of damp canvas sails she found in a corner. The cold didn't just sit in the air. It crawled into her marrow and stayed there. By morning, her right knee had swollen to the size of a grapefruit, and her hands were so stiff they looked like bird claws. She tried to make a fist, but the joints refused to close. She sat on the floor and watched the tide retreat through the gaps in the floorboards. She looked at her phone. The battery was at 4%. The screen showed 0 missed calls. There were no texts from the office. There were no messages from the woman she had called her best friend for 30 years. The only notification was an automated alert about her cellular data limit. She watched the little spinning icon until the screen went black. The silence of the phone was louder than the wind outside. She thought, "I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 67 years old with $13.20, and I cannot fix a leaky roof." The math of her survival was too large to look at directly. She sat in the dust and waited. Elias Thorne appeared in the doorway at noon. He didn't knock. He carried a thermos of coffee and a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. He set them on a crate next to her. He didn't ask how she was. He looked up at the ceiling and pointed to a sagging beam. "The water is coming in through the north, flashing," he said. He handed her a roll of heavy-duty bitumen tape and a rusted hammer. "The ladder is behind the mill. If you don't stop the rot now, the winter will finish what Julian started." Eleanor looked at the hammer. Her back felt like a brittle glass rod. "I've never swung a hammer in my life, Elias. I draw the lines. Other people drive the nails." "Then it's time you learned the weight of a nail," Elias said. He turned and walked back toward his truck. He didn't offer to do the work for him. He didn't offer her a room in town. He gave her the tools and left. For the next 3 days, Eleanor moved in a blur of physical agony. She climbed the wooden ladder with a scream caught in her throat every time she moved her knee. She used her silver drafting compass to measure the gaps in the stone walls. She stuffed the cracks with a mixture of mud and dried reeds she gathered from the estuary. She hammered the bitumen tape over the holes in the roof until her palms were blistered and bloody. She ate cold kibble with Barnaby because she was too tired to find a way to heat water. She slept for 4 hours at a time, waking when the tide rushed under the floorboards. She was a lead architect who had managed $40 million budgets. Now she was a woman who celebrated finding a dry piece of driftwood she could use for a shelf. On the 4th night, the storm arrived. The wind screamed through the gaps in the window frames. Rain lashed against the stone walls with the force of gravel. A massive leak opened directly over Eleanor's sleeping spot. The canvas sail was soaked in minutes. The floor became a shallow lake of salt water and silt. Eleanor stood in the dark, shivering so hard her teeth clicked. She looked at the door. Her car was still in the yard. She could drive back to the city. She could beg Julian for a room in the basement. She could admit she was as broken as he said she was. She reached into her pocket and felt the silver compass. She pulled it out and held it up to a single sliver of moonlight that broke through the clouds. The metal didn't bend. It didn't break. It remained perfectly true, a fixed point in the middle of the chaos. Barnaby stood up and pressed his warm flank against her leg. He looked up at her and let out a huff. "I am not dying in a shed," Eleanor whispered to the empty room. "I am not dying because some man decided I wasn't worth keeping. I am an architect. I know how to hold things together." She grabbed the bucket and went back into the rain. The storm had passed, leaving the mill draped in a heavy, shivering silence. Eleanor Vance was 67 years old when she stood on a wobbly wooden crate to inspect the damage to the central support beam. The wood was ancient white oak, thick as a ship's mast and scarred by a century of salt and dust. Water was still weeping from a hairline fracture near the ceiling joint. It dripped steadily onto the floorboards with a sound like a ticking clock. Barnaby wouldn't stop whining. The old dog wasn't looking at the leak. He was sitting at the base of the pillar, his grey muzzle pressed against a knot in the wood. He pawed at the floor, his claws clicking against the grain. Eleanor ignored him at first. She was busy trying to wedge a piece of cedar shim into the crack to divert the water. She reached into her pocket for her silver drafting compass. It was her only remaining precision tool. She used the sharp metal point to probe the depth of the rot in the beam. The metal sank 2 inches into what should have been solid heartwood. It didn't feel like soft decay. It felt like empty space. Eleanor stepped down from the crate. Her knees gave a sharp, grinding protest that made her catch her breath. She knelt beside Barnaby. She ran her fingers over the surface of the oak. There was a faint, horizontal seam about 3 feet from the floor. It was so fine it looked like a natural growth ring. But when she pressed her thumb against it, the wood didn't give. It shifted. Her hands began to tremble. She took the silver compass and wedged the needle-thin point into the seam. She applied a slow, steady pressure. The wood groaned. A rectangular section of the beam, 4 inches wide and 10 inches long, began to pivot outward. It was a masterfully hidden pressure plate, carved from the same piece of timber to hide the grain. Behind the panel sat a dull, grey cylinder. It was a zinc canister, sealed with a threaded cap and coated in a fine layer of wax. Eleanor reached into the dark cavity. Her fingers felt the cold metal. She pulled it out slowly, as if she were handling a live bird. The weight of it was surprising. She sat on the floor in a patch of weak morning light. Barnaby lay his head on her thigh. She struggled with the cap for several minutes. Her grip was weak from 3 days of manual labor. She used the legs of the drafting compass as a lever, twisting the metal until the wax seal snapped. Inside the canister was a roll of heavy vellum paper. It was tied with a ribbon of faded black silk. Eleanor untied the knot. The paper uncurled with a stiff, dry protest. The handwriting at the top was bold and elegant. It was the script of Arthur Vance, Julian's grandfather. Eleanor read the first paragraph. She read it again. Then she read it a third time, her eyes moving faster with every line. She stopped breathing for a moment. The air in the mill felt suddenly charged, as if a circuit had been closed. The document was not a diary. It was a 1922 Matrimonial Trust Deed. It detailed the ownership of the Blackwater Estuary lands, including the very ground the city firm's headquarters sat upon. Arthur Vance had been a man who believed in the sanctity of partnership. He had written a clause that Julian had clearly never seen. The land was a gift to the bloodline, but it carried a specific legal weight. If any male heir attempted to dissolve a marriage or a partnership through fraudulent means, the entire estate, the mill, the city land, and the development rights would revert instantly to the spouse. The deed had been witnessed by a justice of the peace and a local clerk named Thorne. Eleanor's hand went to her mouth. She looked at the silver compass sitting on the floorboards. Her father had given it to her to build things that lasted. Julian had given her this ruin because he thought it was a graveyard for her dignity. He didn't know that his grandfather had turned this mill into a vault. She looked at the signature of the witness, Elias Thorne. The man from the general store hadn't been waiting for her out of curiosity. He had been waiting for her to find the truth he had kept secret for 60 years. The legal language was clear. The forgery Julian had used to steal the firm didn't just break the law. It triggered the trust. According to the vellum in her lap, Eleanor didn't just own a rotting mill. She owned the ground Julian was standing on in his penthouse 500 miles away. She leaned her back against the beam. A small, sharp laugh escaped her lips. It was the first time she had laughed since the afternoon in the attorney's office. She looked at Barnaby. The dog wagged his tail, hitting the zinc canister with a hollow metallic ring. Julian thought he was clearing the ledger, she whispered. She stood up. The pain in her knees was still there, but it felt distant now. She carefully rolled the vellum back into the cylinder. She tucked the silver compass into the breast pocket of her green coat. The tide was coming in again, rushing under the floorboards with a roar of new energy. She had been a lead architect for 40 years. She knew how to read a site plan. She knew how to find the weakness in a structure, and she had just found the crack that would bring Julian's entire world down. She wasn't a victim waiting for a rescue anymore. 67-year-old Eleanor Vance did not go to a hardware store with the $13.20 remaining in her pocket. She went to the shoreline at low tide with a burlap sack and her silver drafting compass. She spent the first week scraping 3 decades of dried salt and river silt from the stone walls with a rusted putty knife she found in the mill's cellar. Her lower back throbbed with a rhythmic heat that made every movement a negotiation. She didn't stop until the original grey granite of the foundation emerged from beneath the grime. She used the compass to measure the depth of the mortar gaps between the stones. She needed to know exactly how much structural integrity remained before the autumn gales arrived. She began a daily ritual of scavenging. She walked the mudflats for hours with Barnaby trotting at her heels. She collected sun-bleached driftwood that was hard as iron and salt-cured by the Atlantic. She carried the heavy grey planks back to the mill one by one. She used the wood to replace the rotted sections of the floorboards where the tide had eaten the pine. She didn't have a power saw. She used an old crosscut saw Elias Thorne had left on her doorstep. The work was slow and the wood was stubborn. She spent 3 hours on a single cut, her breath coming in ragged gasps in the cold air. But when the new plank fit into the gap with a satisfying thud, she felt a surge of precision she hadn't felt in years. Elias arrived every Tuesday morning in his battered blue pickup truck. He never brought money or groceries. He brought buckets of lime and bags of coarse river sand. He showed Eleanor how to mix a traditional mortar that would breathe with the stone. She spent 10 days on her knees, pointing the joints of the interior walls. The lime burned the small cuts on her fingers. The skin on her palms became thick and calloused like a bricklayer's. She didn't look like a lead architect who had managed $40 million budgets anymore. She looked like a woman who was merging with the building she was trying to save. The transformation moved from the walls to the windows. The original glass was gone, replaced by jagged shards and spider webs. Eleanor found a stack of discarded window sashes behind the general store. They were the wrong size for the mill's deep stone casements. She spent 2 days measuring and recalculating the angles. She used her silver compass to scribe the lines on the wood. She stripped the old paint and sanded the frames until the grain of the heart pine showed through. She didn't buy expensive sealant. She used a mixture of linseed oil and beeswax she bartered. By the time the first frost hit the estuary, the mill had changed. The skeletal rafters were no longer visible through holes in the roof. Eleanor had patched the leaks with reclaimed slate. The interior didn't smell like mold and wet dog anymore. It smelled of cedar shavings and wood smoke. She built a small hearth in the center of the room, using river stones. The beauty of the transformation was not in new paint or modern fixtures. It was in the way the light began to interact with the structure. On a clear Tuesday afternoon, the sun hit the surface. The light bounced off the moving water and entered the mill through the lower windows. It projected a series of shimmering golden ripples across the restored oak ceiling. The entire room seemed to breathe. Eleanor stood in the center of the floor and watched the light move. It was a detail she hadn't planned, a gift from the geometry of the building itself. She moved her drafting table, a flat door salvaged from the cellar, into the path of the sun. She laid out the zinc canister and the vellum documents next to her silver compass. The mill was no longer a ruin. It was a fortress of evidence. The stone walls were solid, the roof was tight, the floor was level. She had used her architect's mind to build a space where the truth could finally be told. She looked at her hands. They were scarred and dirty, but they were no longer trembling. She had spent 40 years building glass towers for a man who didn't value the foundation. Now she had built a home for herself out of the things the world had thrown away. The mill was standing tall against the wind. It was enough. Eleanor sat at her makeshift desk as the first snow of November dusted the salt marsh. She didn't think about the mahogany boardroom or the smell of Julian's expensive cologne anymore. She thought about the way the frost settled into the grain of the white oak beam. She was 67 years old and she wasn't waiting for someone to approve her blueprints. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver drafting compass. She set it on the vellum deed. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered to the empty room. She was looking at the carved compass on the lintel above the door. "You knew he would try to tear it all down, Arthur." She felt a quiet warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the hearth fire. It was the feeling of a structure that had finally found its true center. She wasn't the wife of a successful man anymore. She was the architect of her own survival. The community didn't arrive with a formal invitation. They came in pickup trucks and on foot, drawn by the sound of her hammer and the sight of the smoke from her chimney. Mrs. Gable from the diner brought a loaf of sourdough and asked if Eleanor could look at the settling foundation of her porch. A young fisherman named Caleb stopped by with a crate of oysters. He wanted to know how to brace his pier against the winter ice. Eleanor didn't charge them. She used her silver compass and a piece of charcoal to sketch diagrams on the back of old wallpaper. She showed them how to read the wind and the water. She explained the physics of a tension rod and the importance of a properly sloped roof. The people of Blackwater didn't see a discarded woman from the city. They saw a master of her craft, who lived in a mill that should have fallen down a decade ago. They brought her fresh eggs and bundles of dry firewood. They brought her news of the world beyond the estuary. One evening, a group of local teenagers helped her hoist a heavy iron bell back into the small cupola on the roof. They didn't ask for payment. They wanted to hear the bell ring across the marsh for the first time in 50 years. When the rope pulled taut and the metal struck the clapper, the sound was deep and clear. It rolled over the water and echoed against the trees. Eleanor felt the vibration of the bell in her own bones. It was a physical sensation of alignment. The tension in her shoulders had finally dissolved into a steady, grounded strength. She stood on the deck she had rebuilt with her own hands. She watched the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cold and sharp. Her lungs felt full and clear. She was no longer a shadow in someone else's office. The black SUV did not belong on the gravel road of Blackwater Estuary. It moved slowly, its tires crunching over the salt-crusted stones like a predator stalking through dry grass. The paint was a deep, artificial obsidian that reflected the grey sky and the skeletal trees. It stopped 20 yards from the mill's front door. Julian Vance stepped out of the driver's side. He was wearing a camel hair coat and Italian leather loafers that were never meant to touch mud. He looked at the restored stone walls and the spinning waterwheel with a thin, tight smile. Eleanor Vance stood on the deck she had built from salvaged driftwood. She was 67 years old, and her hands were covered in a fine layer of white lime dust from the morning's masonry work. She didn't wipe them. She didn't move. She watched Julian adjust his cuffs. He looked up at the mill, his eyes scanning the new slate roof and the clean window sashes. He didn't see the woman. He saw an asset he had undervalued. "Eleanor," Julian said. He began walking toward her, his shoes picking up grey silt with every step. He kept his hands in his pockets. "You've been busy. We've been worried about you, Mom. We heard you were out here living in a ruin. We're just being realistic. This isn't a place for someone of your standing." Barnaby stood at Eleanor's side. The dog didn't growl. He didn't bark. He stood as still as the stone foundation. His grey muzzle pointed directly at the man who had abandoned him. Eleanor reached into her pocket and felt the cold, sharp point of her silver drafting compass. "I'm not living in a ruin, Julian," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet and flat. It carried over the sound of the rushing tide without effort. Julian stopped at the base of the deck. He looked at the lime dust on her coat and the calluses on her fingers. He gave a short, condescending laugh. "It's a charming hobby, Eleanor, truly. But let's be honest. At your age, you can't manage a property like this alone. You'll be so much more comfortable back in the city. I've found a very exclusive assisted living community near the park. It's what's best for everyone." He pulled a leather folder from his coat. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the folder. "I've had the lawyers draw up a quitclaim deed. I'll buy the mill back from you for double the tax value. It's more than enough for the deposit on the new place. It's a clean break, Eleanor. Dad would have wanted this." Eleanor didn't reach for the folder. She didn't look at the paper. "Why do you want a pile of wet rocks, Julian? You told the court it was worthless." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He glanced toward the north end of the estuary, where a line of survey stakes now stood in the marsh. "The county is planning a bridge. This land is the only deep water access point for the new resort. But that's business, Eleanor. You wouldn't understand the complexities. 40 years is a long time to string someone along, even if she was essentially just the drafting help." He stepped closer, holding the pen out, like a peace offering. "Just sign the paper. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Eleanor took a slow breath. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out the zinc canister. She didn't open it. She held it so the light hit the wax seal Julian's grandfather had placed there 80 years ago. "I found the 1922 Matrimonial Trust, Julian." Julian froze. The color drained from his face so quickly it looked like a mask. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He looked at the canister and then at the mill. "Arthur was a better architect than you," Eleanor said. "He built a foundation that doesn't allow for structural fraud. The moment you forged my name on the partnership divestment, you triggered the reversion clause. You don't own the firm's headquarters on 5th Street anymore. You don't own the development rights to the riverside. According to this deed, I own the ground you're standing on right now." Julian dropped the leather folder. It landed in the mud, the white pages soaking up the grey water. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Those documents were lost in the fire of '74. "They weren't lost," Eleanor said. "They were waiting. You gave me this mill because you thought I was a discarded remnant of your old life. You thought I would fade away in the salt air." She stepped to the edge of the deck. She looked down at the man who had stolen 40 years of her work with a single pen stroke. She felt no anger. She felt no triumph. She felt the steady, unyielding weight of a building that had been tested and found true. "You should have checked the support beams, Julian," she said. "The law is a lot like architecture. If the foundation is built on a lie, the whole structure eventually collapses." Julian reached for the railing, his hand shaking. "We can settle this, Eleanor. We're family. We'll find a way to make this fair." "We already settled it," Eleanor said. "You chose the paperwork. I chose the truth." She turned and walked toward the heavy oak door. She didn't look back to see him standing in the mud. She didn't look back to see him picking up his ruined folder. She whistled for Barnaby. The dog followed her inside, his tail giving one sharp thump against the doorframe. The heavy iron bolt slid home with a definitive, metallic click. Julian stood alone in the silence of the marsh. 1 year after the morning, she arrived at the edge of the Blackwater Estuary. The tide moved with a different sound. The mill was no longer a hunched giant hiding in the fog. The stone walls were clean, and the mortar was white and sharp. The waterwheel turned with a steady, low hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Eleanor's boots. It was a sound of constant motion and quiet purpose. Eleanor Vance sat on the deck in the early April sun. She was 68 years old now. She wore a simple linen shirt and her old forest green coat, though the frayed silk lining had been replaced with sturdy wool. Her hands were still calloused and strong, the skin marked by the honest work of stone and timber. Barnaby lay at her feet, his grey muzzle resting on a patch of sun-warmed wood. He was 12 now and moved with a dignified stiffness, but his tail still gave a sharp thump whenever Eleanor spoke his name. A small wooden sign stood by the gravel turnoff. It read, "Vance Architectural Preservation." There were no glass towers or mahogany boardrooms in her life anymore. There was only the smell of cedar, sawdust, and the constant, bracing scent of the salt marsh. The city firm had been restructured after the documents in the zinc canister were validated by the High Court. Julian had settled the case within 10 days of the first hearing. He had been forced to return the assets he had moved into offshore accounts. He was gone now, living in a rented apartment in a city where nobody recognized his face or his name. Eleanor had kept the estuary land and the mill. She had sold the corporate headquarters to a non-profit that provided housing for retired teachers and nurses. She didn't need a penthouse. She had a hearth and a roof that no longer leaked, no matter how hard the wind blew from the Atlantic. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver drafting compass. The metal was polished and bright. She set the sharp point in the center of a fresh sheet of vellum. She didn't draw a line of defense or a boundary for a legal battle. She drew a perfect, graceful circle. She was designing a community center for the town of Blackwater. It would be built of the same granite as the mill. She looked up at the granite lintel above the door. The carved compass was visible through the budding spring ivy. She thought about the man who had hidden the truth in a hollow oak beam 80 years ago. She thought about the weight of a legacy that survives the people who built it. The foundation held. "Arthur," she said to the quiet air. She turned back to her desk. Eleanor Vance's journey proves that the most enduring structures are not made of glass and steel. They are built of truth and resilience. Justice is not a favor granted by the powerful. It is the natural result of a foundation that refuses to crack under the weight of a lie. No matter how many years pass, a blueprint of integrity remains valid. The storm may take the shingles, and the salt may eat the iron. But the geometry of a life well lived cannot be unmade. The tidal mill stands as a testament to the fact that what is discarded by one generation is often the salvation of the next. Julian saw a ruin because he only valued what he could sell. Eleanor saw a sanctuary because she knew how to read the hidden strength in the grain. We are often told that the world belongs to the fast and the young. We are told that our names can be erased by a newer signature or a colder heart, but the tide always reveals what is heavy enough to remain. Eleanor did not find her peace in the millions she reclaimed. She found it in the calluses on her hands and the steady chime of the bell she hung herself. She found it in the silence of a house where every board was placed with intention. She proved that being 68 is not the end of a story, but the beginning of a mastery that no one can forge. The silver compass in her pocket is no longer just a tool for drawing lines. It is a symbol of a life that stayed true to its center while everything else was spinning out of control. The story of the mill is the story of every person who has been told they are a pile of wet rocks. It reminds us that the most valuable treasures are rarely found in vaults or bank accounts. They are found in the places we were told to abandon. They are hidden in the support beams of the things we built when we thought no one was watching. Eleanor Vance didn't just rebuild a mill. She rebuilt the idea that a person can be discarded but never truly lost. The lights in the mill windows now act as a beacon for the estuary. The fishermen use the white stone walls to navigate their way home in the fog. The building serves the community because the woman inside it learned to serve her own truth first. Julian's glass tower remains in the city, but it is just a shell. The mill is a living, breathing heart. It proves that the weight of a person's life is measured by what they leave standing when the weather is at its worst. Eleanor still walks the mudflats with Barnaby every evening. She still carries her father's silver compass. She knows that as long as she has her center, the world can never truly take her ground. She is a woman who knows that time does not diminish a legacy. It only clarifies the structure. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you've ever felt the cold sting of betrayal from someone who should have protected your heart, leave one word in the comments describing the feeling of the moment Eleanor opened that zinc canister and changed her destiny. Because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. A life built on integrity can weather any storm, but a house built on deceit will always eventually find its own basement. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their value is not determined by the people who were too small to see it, because together we prove that dreams don't age.